Hello and welcome to today's presentation on California privacy law. Hey, where's my data? My name is Jen and I will be your moderator for today's presentation. The webinar will be presented by Mark Coder of TV Rhineland Open Sky and Marcely Hancock of the EPS Foundation. Marcely Hancock is the CEO and president of the EP3 Foundation. She has over 20 years of global experience working with policy leaders in Fortune 100 companies to maximize the ability of technology to improve quality of life, education, and economic opportunities. She works to build robust communication networks along with proactive online safety and security initiatives, and is deeply involved in measuring and defining positive digital cultures, responsible regulatory frameworks, data privacy, data compliance, and effective education initiatives globally. Mark Coder is the Chief Information Security Officer for TV Rhineland Open Sky. Mark also has over 28 years of experience in varying sized organizations across industry sectors and is responsible for TV Rhineland's Center of Excellence covering privacy, risk, and compliance. Mark has contributed to many organizations, including information sharing and analysis centers, and is a technical fellow with the EP3 Foundation. For today's presentation, each of you is in listen-only mode. We encourage you to submit questions via the question panel, and those questions will be answered during a Q&A at the end of the webinar, time permitting. Please note that the presentation is also available as a PDF download in the handout section. At this time, I'd like to turn things over to Mark. Mark, please go ahead.
Thanks, Jen, and thank you all for joining. While there's plenty of work going on in our practices across the globe helping clients adopt Europe's GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, California's Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, deserves at least an equal amount of attention. California, after all, is the fifth largest economy in the world, a commonly sought after market, a birthplace of many technology innovators, and yet again, the first state in the US to develop more comprehensive privacy expectations. This law, similar to GDPR, is consumer focused and sets a new bar within the United States. We're now reading that a U.S. federal law, similar in concept to CCPA, could be introduced early in 2019, granting the Federal Trade Commission enforcement authority across the union. We want you to be ready for situations where people turn to your company and ask, hey, where's my data? And what are you going to do with it? In this webinar, we will share how losing customer data can get you into trouble, building your own privacy digital toolkit, including the big basics of new age privacy, steps to future-proof your network exchange, and address the question, can the approach to CCPA support GDPR as well? Let's start with an overview of the CCPA scope. We're going to walk through who has to comply and who is protected, when it will become effective, how it will be enforced, what the sanctions are and the remedies, what is protected and what is excluded.
Well, let's start with who has to comply. When you look at the new types of things that have to happen with this California law, it's really a big deal. So Mark, thank you. It's such a pleasure to work with you, and I appreciate your experience and leadership. And one of the things I appreciate the most about working with you and your team at TUV Open Sky is your ability to create communication tools that C-suite, our business people can really understand about what's required to protect data and comply with these new, very different legal frameworks. So let's start with who has to comply and who's protected. First, if your company is mid-sized, meaning 25 million in revenue, or if you have 50,000 records, personal information that can be tied to an individual or to a device annually, or even if you're a smaller company and 50% of your revenue is coming in from the sale of personal information. And then it's important to note that the consumer is as defined as a resident of California for tax purposes. So it's pretty broad. You could have someone who is a resident of California not living in California when you gather their information, but still California law applies. So when will it become effective? Well, enforcement won't be effective for a little bit over a year. However, starting within 3 weeks, January of 19, we'll need to have logs for the look back, 12-month look back provision. So we can look for some additional regulations from the Attorney General before July, and hopefully there'll be some more guidance, but we need to be prepared and organized to be able to gather the information we need for that log, and that starts in a few weeks. So how will it be enforced? Well, the California Attorney General enforces California privacy laws. Now, historically, they are active, so we can expect to see this new law enforced. The law does give you a 30-day cure period. Now, it also has gives California citizens the individual right of private action. Now, that's for specifically a data breach. Now, this is not the first law to give California residents the private right of action. For example, California has the right to, if you have substance use information that's undisclosed, unauthorized and is disclosed, private right of action is available for that individual. But what's really different is that this broadens that right out to any California resident over a breach that they've been impacted. So it's a pretty big deal. And then just to remember, California also has very strict data breach notification requirements. So any type of organization, even nonprofits or education institutions, if there's a data breach that involves more than 500 residents in California, then a report must be filed to the Attorney General and notifications must go out to those individuals. So the only good news is that if that information was encrypted, then there's no notifications required and it's not considered a breach. So another good cause for good encryption. Then last, what are the sanctions and remedies? Well, unintentional violations are $2,500 per, and intentional $7,500. Then the civil action is not less than $100 or not greater than $750 per consumer per incident, or actual damages, whichever's greater.
Let's take a look at what's protected. Very broad categories of information, really anything related to consumers, their actions, and their households. So remember the Internet of Things too. And there's special emphasis on data linkages between people and their home networks and devices. There's an extensive, non-exhaustive list of information categories, which include things like physical characteristics, psychological trends, predispositions, and given the household scope, IoT manufacturers and operational technology organizations must also be prepared. There's consent similar to the GDPR, with things like explicit opt-in and opt-out and transparency. There's consumer rights crossing the entire data management lifecycle. And what may be excluded is what's defined as publicly available information and appropriately protected health information, which can be viewed a couple of different ways. HIPAA-covered entities and healthcare providers governed by the Confidentiality of Medical Information Act, medical information governed by HIPAA and the Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health, PHI collected by both covered entities and business associates, and information collected as part of a clinical trial, as long as it's covered and protected by the HIPAA program. Similar language is in place for GLIBA, DPPA, and CIPA, Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, Drivers Privacy Protection Act, and the California Financial Information Privacy Act. There's a lot to know about CCPA, and it's still changing. Let's really focus on the principles to anticipate the right course of action. Marcelie is now going to take you through the rights of consumer.
Thanks, Mark. The new California privacy law gives California residents new privacy rights. They have access and new rights to access, and they have the right to know some things, to opt out of others, and they must have the ability to request that their information is deleted. And another concept that the C-suite executives must understand is that this new law creates additional governance for teens aged 13 through 16. So let's walk through the consumer rights one by one. First, California residents have the right to know the categories or the specific pieces of personal information, along with our sources of collecting that information about them. It's huge. So remember, if you have a mid-sized company or even a small company, but half of your revenue is coming in from selling personal information, then we have to be ready. So personal information, and thanks for your definition, it's as broad as you can imagine. So it's, if you can think of anything that identifies an individual, their user, their household, or a device, you can just put it into that big picture. Even things that you wouldn't have considered before, things like, considered services purchased, or considered consumer history, or their tendencies, or their electronic activity, or their browsing histories or search histories. There's just so much. If it is at all connected to that user or device, it's going to be covered. So we must disclose the purpose for collecting or selling this information, and we must include the categories of our third-party vendors with access to the information. So what we used to be able to do with defining people as profiles, it may not be sufficient. We'll want to work with our security, privacy, and the risk team to be prepared with the backlog information starting in just 3 weeks. So the next right Californians have is the right to know whether their personal information is sold or disclosed or to whom. Now, when the law talks about sale or sold, it also refers to anything that would be disclosing. So renting, releasing, disclosing, or making available. The definition is very broad. This is new and different, so your leadership teams will need to get started as soon as possible. Now, the next one's tricky. Californians have the right to opt out. Now, qualified companies must create a link on our website to require that personal information not be sold. So in quotes here, the law says a business shall, in a form that is reasonably accessible to consumers, provide a clear and conspicuous link on the business internet homepage titled, "Do not sell my personal information." Now, this page must enable a consumer or a person authorized by the consumer to opt out of the sale of their information. Now, just to be sure that something tricky doesn't happen, the law also states a business shall not require a consumer to create an account in order to direct the business not to sell the consumer's personal information. So this law creates new governance for teens under 16. It's really a big deal. If you know a consumer is under the age of 16 of age, then you cannot sell or share in any way their information without consent. The challenge, one of the big challenges will be identifying the youth and obtaining the required consent. Another right spelled out in the law is the right to equal service and price, even if they exercise their privacy rights. So we cannot discriminate consumers, although we can offer financial incentives. This is very different from what we've been doing all along these 10, 20, 30 years of web commerce. The next right is to be able to access their personal information. So a California resident can request access to their information, and then we have 45 days to provide that information free of charge. And one of the biggest challenges to this right will be verifying the identity of the consumer. So this law requires a response to a verified consumer request. Now, consider the type of information you have. So there are very big business risks to face if the information is disclosed to the wrong individual. So we can look for some potential new regulation or some new information about this clause from the Attorney General, and that we should see before July. So the last one, which is also very similar to GDPR, is the right to have your personal information deleted. So if a California resident requests that their personal information be deleted, it also requires that we notify the third parties that we have provided access. So it requires that we direct those third parties to also delete it. So it's big and it's new, and definitely we don't want to have our head in the sand about the requirements that these new privacy rights provide Californians. So let's take a look at how are we doing with being able to just manage the data that we do have already. Well, unfortunately, 2017 proved to be the worst year for data breaches, like ever, exposing 7.8 billion records. So for the first time since 2007, human mistakes, inadvertent behaviors caused more data loss than malicious intrusion into our networks. So last year, just for context, these human errors accounted for 5.4 billion records. So what that means in real life is that just about all, so 92% of all incidents and 84% of all data breaches were unintentional or inadvertent at nature. Often it's actually still with paper. So that means for us, the highest risk to privacy and security are at the ends of our networks. It's the places where the people that we know and we pay have access and authorize the data use.
So with growing regulations, are we getting any better at safeguarding privacy? Seemingly the answer is no, given what Marceline just shared, and the continuous examples of new large-scale consumer breaches just recently. So how will this be any different? A holistic top-down approach to privacy is required to cut across legal language and make a true difference. So on to building your own privacy digital toolkit and factoring the dimension of the big basics of new age privacy. What we're seeing in California is part of a growing trend worldwide. Together and working with my colleagues across TUV Rhineland's Global Privacy Center of Excellence and with Marceline as a technical fellow of the EP3 Foundation, we define these program level components essential to a holistic privacy approach. We invest in research for successful approaches to building privacy into planning and product design, as we see privacy by design as a differentiator for our customers and their products, and they do as well. One, you need to establish accountability. This involves right-sizing the program for your organization and avoiding conflicts of interest. Two, you need to manage your costs. What are the corporate business risks, the potential loss exposure, and what options are there in privacy investments? Three, you must identify valuables. What consumer information do I really need to make my business run? Four, you must take charge. This involves consumer data flow documentation, privacy impacts, assessments for risk scenarios, and your governance approach at multiple layers we're going to cover. Next, you need to follow the laws, certainly, from understanding requirements to assessing controls to supporting transparency and response to consumer inquiries. Six, you must learn to survive the events. And this gets into incident playbook exercises based on threats to privacy, as well as establishing a post-mortem process for lessons learned. And last but not least, creating security culture through ongoing conversations, tone from the top, and critical key controls for privacy. Now let's cover those in more detail. First off, let's discuss the appropriate balance of responsibilities in the modern digital enterprise. Privacy and security support each other in many regards, but they each have their own priorities, creating potential conflicts of interest without well-established functions and accountability. Establishing a Venn diagram in your organization really matters. Here's a high-level example. Privacy functions must factor inappropriate disclosures, accidents that may occur, including human error, breach handling, reporting to regulators and responding to consumers, and privacy impact assessments. The security function, on the other hand, while supportive of privacy, is not typically accountable for it. At the same time, security is focused on priorities that privacy may or may not be involved in at all, such as the confidentiality of other types of information and data assets, regulated or not, the integrity of systems and information, availability of information and systems as well, even safety situations for cyber and physical security, incidents outside of privacy, and cyber risk assessments such as threat modeling, which is quite different than privacy impact assessments. Next, you must determine the appropriate architecture. This is managing costs now. The appropriate architecture and the appropriate level of investment for privacy. This requires a two-pronged approach. We call this the risk view from the left, loss event scenarios, versus the compliance view from the right. The right is the typical checkbox approach, which is suitable to understand and socialize regulatory requirements like the CCPA, but not useful to prioritize, mature, design, or implement the appropriate controls. To determine priorities, you must look at this as much from the left as you do from the right. The left answers the question, what scenarios can happen given the way we collect, share, and handle consumer data? How much does this impact the consumer? What can be done about it? And how much should we spend on it? it's best to define, mature, and monitor your key controls for consumer privacy. And that may be, say, 60 out of catalogs that cite as many as 300 or more control opportunities. The 80-20 rule of management still applies. So to achieve balance and insight, you want to optimize how you manage the right and refocus conserved energy on the left. The result is privacy by design and effective measurement criteria. Reading the CCPA or any regulation alone doesn't address this. For an excellent example of risk management approaches relevant to consumer data and IT risks, take a look at ISO 31000. Now ask yourself, what does CCPA mean to your organization? How many records do we have? And if we multiply that by the range of fines, what would it cost? How many places does this consumer data exist, and what are the handling procedures? These are inherent factors gauging the probability of a loss. Once you establish the potential loss scenarios in your organization, you can identify the best privacy and security controls. You'll start to notice how controls have different levels of risk reduction effectiveness based on the reduction value and the number of risk scenarios addressed. Not every control is equal, as shown by this example graphic. Your key privacy controls start to emerge through proportional analysis. And as you quantify those risks, you start to make better financial decisions, such as expecting that the initiatives to the right of the project in blue, we call that control number 5 project, those initiatives to the right should cost less. And understanding that initiatives to the left may cost more, and they're probably worth it. This sets the foundation for the cost analysis of controls and projects using a methodology called FAIR, the Factor Analysis of Information Risk, as promoted by the FAIR Institute. It really helps build a case for investment and how you spend your budget across various initiatives wisely. But that's the topic of another webinar series on information and technology risk. So I've shared a link here and in the download today. The identification of valuables or assets is crucial to consumer transparency and protection. You should employ a 2-pillar approach, relying on automation and good old engagement. Through discovery, you have options like network scan tools, configuration management databases, data loss prevention, cloud security access brokers. These things can help find the data. Through governance, you have options like master data management, project oversight, data flow diagrams, data governance boards at multiple levels, both executive and technical, data masking or manufacturing, and privacy impact assessments, including your supply chain.
Well, we've talked about many of the new requirements and mandates regarding personal information and complying with the new generation of privacy laws. These laws include sweeping privacy rights. It's a big deal. The business risk is huge if you're not prepared. And the timeline's short. So January 2019 starts the backlog dates, and enforcement is 2020. However, we don't have to feel completely overloaded. Sure, we have significant discovery and governance work ahead of us. It will require cooperation with our C-suite executive teams, and we'll need to implement next generation tools to automate compliance whenever possible and to meet the rapidly changing regulations. Now, as we do the discovery and governance work that the new California privacy law requires in GDPR, we can also establish a simple privacy framework that ultimately enables us to implement the next generation privacy, security, and safety tools. Now, these simple but critical privacy basics walk through layer by layer, allowing us to take charge of our consumer-oriented privacy and our third-party vendors that have access to it. So at a glance, we have to gather the information that is mission critical. So we have to know the location of the information that's collected, because that's going to set a regulatory and governance requirements. We need to know about the networks. So different types of networks have different spectrum, risks, and policy requirements. We want to know about the devices. So unique device identifiers, the ports, the opportunities and risks around those devices. Then we need to have a handle on the actual application, the operating system, the platforms, the third parties, and the privacy impact on that. And then Last is where we add our people. So this is where we have the human behaviors, the content, and the context about the information. And this we have to keep track of now moving forward. So what information, by whom, for what reason, and how do we get it, and why are we sharing it? All of this we need to be able to gather and document. So let's look at that a little bit more carefully. So starting with location, the California law requires that we know what is gathered from whom and for what purpose. And as we gather up the information about individuals, then it also sets the regulatory requirements that we have, and it makes it much easier for us to, across the board, be able to meet different regulatory frameworks. So this is where we consider what's the nationality, is it state, is there, what are the network capacities or the government surveillance, all the things that are specific to that actual location. Then we're going to consider the networks. This is the actual network. So the IP address, the other network addresses give geographic information so they can help us be prepared. They may also establish other personal identifiers like political or religious affiliation or ethnic background. Those are all really protected under GDPR. So it's something that we want to be able to gather up and keep together. The next one, so if we know the location and we know the network, then we consider the device. So all devices leave a trail of personal information of some type. And California specifically identifies just about anything that can connect a user or their household to a device. So this includes IP addresses and unique identifiers, digital fingerprints, browser fingerprints, anything else that you can think of now is covered under California. So when we know that the devices have their own security weaknesses and opportunities, we also want to consider the breadth of devices with the Internet of Things, and this can be not just the computers or the mobile devices, it can be the tablets and watches and the cameras and the locks and the printers and just all these other things. What an open port and this is where you also consider some of the risks about the open ports and the processes, or what information is stored and gathered and accessed or shared via that device network or other connections. So once we've got our location, we've got our network, we've got our device, now we can talk about the application. So applications tell us a great deal about consumers. They also provide opportunities for verified requests. So we'll be looking at that moving forward when we have to have a verifiable request. So the application identifies the operating system and the personal preferences and often a great deal of information about the individuals just by the applications that they choose. So what applications use open ports and processes and services, what information is shared with the app platform, what apps find, use, create, gather, and share, all of these need to be considered. And also then what are the default settings and the consumer choices. So now we've got an understanding about our location and our network, our device, our application. Now we come to the actual content and the behavior. So this is where, as we move forward, we want to explore architecture changes that allow us to be able to connect our individual consumer with this consistent piece, the consistent sets of information that then allow us to be able to reply and provide the information when requested, and also be able to delete it. So the user's choices with their connected devices, their social networks, the platforms, all of these things that we know by their behaviors, all of it becomes protected under California law. And by following the simple privacy pattern, then we have a consistent way to be able to address all of the components that are required.
Your organization has plenty of regulatory compliance responsibilities as it stands, no doubt. How do we scale and stay focused on true protection at the same time? You'll have to factor classifying and tracking personal information, data governance around any consideration for handling or certainly selling information, disclosure obligations, consumer complaint tracking, and even consent tracking, and sequencing. As an example, there are stipulations around timing opt-in requests to consumers who have recently opted out for a period of time. There are plenty of things to track, so issues management is likely to be an overarching capability need as well. The California State Department of Justice has compiled a lot of good information in one spot, so we've included the reference link here and in your download. Given all those capabilities, as well as staying focused on changing priorities, some technology automation is in good order for efficiency. And if you recall our discussion on risk earlier, efficiency of compliance, the left versus the right, efficiency of compliance allows us to better consider consumer risk scenarios. This gets to the topic of integrated risk management technologies, formerly termed governance, risk, and compliance. They give you efficiencies such as top-down risk management and cyber risk quantification. We talked about that with the FAIR methodology a bit. Key risk indicators, KRIs, for more dynamic probability analysis of risks. Harmonization of controls, so you can measure once and comply to many regulations simultaneously. Alignment to control standards. Now, these are the best practice guidelines out there, and making those part of your organizational DNA and your practitioners' approaches is very valuable. And really important, documented, auditable processes. Remember, you've got fines ranging from $2,500 to $7,500, and it depends on how well you demonstrate what your intent was in the care and handling. So having these processes documented is much better than not having them at all. And then testing those processes, of course, doing what you say you do. And that gets to another topic, key performance indicators, KPIs, for continual assurance of key controls. Remember, the controls that do the most to protect consumers based on risk scenarios, the key controls, deserve continual monitoring. And that's what KPIs are all about. Trend monitoring, established thresholds, not just spot audits or annual audits. They're too important. The move from GRC to integrated risk management in the market is important and supports management decision support and digital age privacy. But even with proper prioritization and efficient compliance, it's still crucial to address a potential for data breach, and right away, especially while you're continuing to improve, identifying and continuing to improve your privacy program and posture. In California, there's a private right of action, again, to bring suits against businesses that violate their duty to implement and maintain reasonable security procedures. That's straight from the California Civil Code. And this addresses theft and losses involving personal information that has not been encrypted and unauthorized access. So what are the components that put surviving the breach into practice? Well, certainly incident management, right? Which should be practiced and documented based on those scenarios we established back in the management of costs and by establishing a true risk management framework for privacy, leveraging frameworks like ISO 31000. But what if a privacy breach is part of a broader incident? You need to make sure that compound attack scenarios, as they happen, that cause multiple outcomes to an organization, perhaps across security and privacy, availability and breach, that these are well accounted for and designed into your incident flows. And for inadvertent disclosures versus cyber attacks resulting in privacy breaches, what will your communication templates look like? You want to prepare these ahead of time. And you want a copywriter to review these and so that you're being sensitive to consumer concerns, given those very different situations. Lessons learned. As part of any incident closure, and immediately while things are fresh in people's minds, you want to do a post-mortem review. Accidents do happen, but they're an excellent opportunity to learn, to test, and tune. You don't want to make the same mistake twice. And that gets into prioritized remediation plans. Again, with that risk management framework we talked about earlier. When you decide to remediate based on lessons learned, these plans need to be compared with other activities already in flight. Perhaps activities driven by testing, audit, and scans, likely to have your business, your developers, and your IT teams busy already. So rather than dumping that out there, demonstrating to them that priorities are always considered in a consistent manner. It really promotes a healthy culture of focus and action in your organization. Security is the foundation for any good privacy program, including the CCPA. While an exhaustive look at security is part of our broader library content available on TUV OpenSky and not today's topic, here's some building blocks relevant to privacy anywhere in the world. that you should consider. First, the sweeping comprehensive security program approach covering charter, accountability, process flows, and controls. A simple example being ISO 27001 and 27002 combined. Layer on that meaningful employee awareness, held regularly and including the business context of consumer data handling across your organization. Don't forget marketing, product design, operations, data scientists especially, and IT. Data stewardship. Make sure the ownership of consumer data isn't a mystery in your organization. Work this out with privacy, the data governance board at any level, or go straight to the chief digital officer if you need to. And for access recertification by the data stewards, consider behavioral risks now available through security analytics, and for those being recertified, are they exhibiting risky behavior? And look to reduce overly entitled users. And remember that those user accounts include service accounts defined for application access, device access, and business-to-business use. It's not just about the humans. Make sure you're involved early in security, as early as the business innovation phase. That's where privacy requirements start to evolve and need to be considered. So define a chief security architect for your organization if you haven't already, and follow the guidelines of the Open Group and its architectural framework, TOGAF, as an example. Practice habitual encryption and key management to support those encryption keys. Those keys can get lost, stolen, expire. Missing this because encryption is hard to do is no longer forgivable in the eyes of privacy regulators. And don't forget that security, privacy, and the Office of the Chief Technology Officer can and should put their heads together around innovation. There's a lot going on here, and we're going to cover one example of that next. Share and interpret threat and vulnerability analysis on a daily basis. Make sure that people in different roles, including privacy, understand threat activity. Update their assumptions of risk probabilities and take action on remediation prioritization. This should be consumed daily. And certainly, do not forget about the cloud. You can use the cloud for consumer data, but the control implementations, the stacks, and the accountability that's split across the cloud provider versus you, the organization, use their services, needs to be well understood, because you both have responsibilities and taken seriously. Now, armed with this privacy digital toolkit that we just went through, you can expand your visibility to the business ecosystem. A business and information technology architecture is no longer defined by the four walls of your data center. Exposing more and more consumer information through APIs to your business ecosystem across the internet is the norm now. Think business-to-business transactions. Think business-to-business to consumer. Think direct-to-consumer. Your digital strategy. This is an incredible area for what we call privacy-enhancing technology and privacy innovation. We're going to cover a privacy network example of that. Looking at those broader business ecosystems and complying with regulations at the state and federal level, well, this has an interesting history to it. And this is where Marcelly already said, this is about architecture, not just regulation and checking the boxes. Consider this real situation, which dates back to the early 2000s. I know, I lived it. Now, ironically enough, California pressed for greater privacy with healthcare insurance providers, specifically to avoid the use of Social Security numbers in the enrollment of consumers and the processing of healthcare claims. So the insurers doing business in California spent millions of dollars over several years deprecating SSN storage and use. It was a tremendous effort in re-architecting data relationships, verification, and lookup routines. But then healthcare reform passes at a later date, right, at the federal level. And that brought about a new requirement that those very same insurers include Social Security numbers when reporting who purchased insurance to the IRS annually for tax return audit purposes. This is a serious conundrum, right? Brought about by different regulatory goals at different times and from different levels. Now, if you were the CTO of one of those organizations, would you put social security numbers back into your core systems all over the place again? Would you put them in a special enclave and try to relate them securely, like a PCI approach? Or, in this modern day of innovation, would you leverage an external privacy solution matching SSNs on the fly when they're reported without taking possession again? Let's take a look at that third option. Marcella?
Okay, I love that example. It's tragic. It's so true. So yes, there are new opportunities to create privacy networks, and the EP3 in our foundation stands for empowering people with privacy and personalization. So our goal is to help companies and individuals set up the architecture that's required so that in the cloud services they can protect their privacy and confidentiality. They have improved ways to verify the identities and the roles across many networks. And then once they've verified that identity, then you can link privacy protected, even at granular levels, and share when it's allowed, but only with whom it's allowed. And we can also enforce automatically. So let's take a look at an illustration of what this would look like. So with the foundation, we collaborate with the stakeholders and trust authorities to set the rules and governance to develop these new types of credentials and accreditations for privacy networks. So the new laws absolutely require new architectures. So with the EP3 Foundation establishes these privacy networks and it's based on breakthrough innovation with top-tier trusted industry leaders and partners. So privacy domains are software-defined networks that transform information by binding or hashing criteria and credentials to the smallest attribute level from everything gathered from an individual. This includes the credentials from the team that documents your verified consent. So when we looked at the privacy pattern, this is how we can manage all of the variables and not have a honeypot of information. So the privacy networks cryptographically bind different trust criteria and trust credentials to different resources, creating attribute level trust blocks. So we call them proof of trust or trust blocks, and they're used to automate the enforcement, verify the identities, and share the information. So these networks allow us to pool and anonymize and share and analyze sensitive data while complying with privacy and security regulations. They also eliminate the risk of data breach because the information inside the trust blocks is completely fully opaque. Even if someone unauthorized were to access the trust blocks, no data breach notifications are required because no information was actually disclosed. So this eliminates so much risk and allows us then to reconnect when needed and only when needed Social Security with our patients, depending on how the laws come and go between different states or different countries. It's exciting.
Yeah, and I really enjoy being part of EP3 because so much of the emphasis is on the business development and the transactions and the trust agreements. This is you don't build a privacy network with one organization. It's the organizations that need to work together and work collaboratively on that approach. Again, it's an architecture. So with your digital toolkit in place and your sights set on privacy networks, perhaps for the broader ecosystem, let's talk about your global business synergies and the relationship of CCPA to the GDPR. First, does the GDPR apply to your company and its current or future strategy? Is your company established in the EU? Are you offering goods or services to EU data subjects? Are you monitoring the behavior of EU data subjects where the behavior takes place in the EU? GDPR protects natural persons called data subjects. In order to lawfully process personal data, a legitimate basis is needed as well as consent. Special categories of data such as health information, revealing racial or ethnic origin, political or religious beliefs, etc., well, they're all subject to higher protection. Europe has 28 countries with unique and growing data privacy authorities and coordination for enforcement. The fines under the GDPR, well, they can be up to 20 million euro or 4% of worldwide revenue, whichever is higher. And we've seen some of the first fines being levied. As example, in Portugal, there was a 400,000 euro fine to a hospital for access issues. And in Germany, a 20,000 euro fine for unencrypted passwords. In Austria, a fine issued because an IP camera was recording too much. And in France, a retailer, different sector here, fined 250,000 euro.
Well, there are similarities between the GDPR and the California privacy laws. From the back end, the homework you're going to do is going to be very similar. GDPR protects the information, it's just as well as the California law. There's a couple of differences where California is going to exclude information that's made available lawfully from government records. So the rights to the individuals are very similar. GDPR goes far beyond, but still the California law includes rights that are going to be requiring a lot of extra work, like the right to delete. The European regulation also contains additional processing principles. So they might call things a little differently. You might be a data subject in GDPR, and you're going to be a consumer or a resident in California. The mechanisms for enforcement are also very similar. They're not the same, but they're similar. So one's the right to an effective judicial remedy and a right to receive compensation. There's also potentially fines by regulatory authorities. So just the overall, the people who are protected and how you need to manage, there's so many similarities, and GDPR goes far beyond CCPA in the rights, but there's some drastic changes to U.S. privacy law now with California, so it's a good time to get started.
We know there's a lot of things to consider here as we were preparing for sharing all this with you, but there's a lot of business at stake too. So we're sharing some take-home questions in the download today. I'm not going to go through them again, but it's kind of a roll-up of a lot of things we touched on in one tear sheet for you. We hit on the themes of rationalizing the program and the costs, sustainability and efficiencies, data management lifecycle, strategic opportunities for innovation, remembering geolocation capabilities, and of course logging with the 12-month look back. So this again will be in your download, which brings us to the get started activities. Take home message for you. First, how do you get started with all this at hand? First, complete a privacy baseline assessment or combined assessment given your targeted markets globally. From that, establish a privacy roadmap which factors and links to privacy innovation from your CTO. And make sure that the priorities and cost rationale are assessed using a matured risk management program like the one we discussed. Then you can initiate your privacy build out and expansion. Remember, expanding an existing program like a GDPR, like HIPAA, like GLIBA may be the smartest approach here. Leverage privacy management automation with a coordinated IRM or GRC strategy. Make sure you consider the intricacies of IoT privacy. If your products include physical technology, or even if they don't, you may have APIs that support a partner's IoT device based on a business relationship. This is common, becoming more and more common for many analytics and information-centric companies. I could share that we had to retrofit and create specific IoT privacy services and certifications within our organization to address this. Make sure privacy is designed and practiced as part of incident management early on. Get started right on that. And last but not least, factor privacy and privacy impact assessments to tier your risk, your expectations, and your illegal agreements with your third parties. And remember, those three first steps are valuable in establishing buy-in across your organization as you grow, launch, or relaunch your privacy program. Well, thank you so much for joining. Marcelie and I were thrilled with the opportunity to work together and bring together the wisdom and practices of both EP3 Foundation and TUV Open Sky as a member of the TUV Rhineland Global Organization. We're now going to open the line to questions. Jen?
Thank you, Mark. We did receive a couple questions, so we'll get right into them. The first one is, how do I prepare our company to comply with the opt-in requirements for young teens ages 13 through 16?
Oh, this is a good one. This is such a good one. We do not want our head in the sand about this. This is the first time we've had to navigate new data governance for this age group. So we're used to COPPA, which is before. So managing these permissions is going to be really difficult because we don't have a way to identify teens across the United States. And we don't have a way to safely link their sensitive data from different resources. Now, this is where EP3 Foundation can be extremely helpful. Companies can now build privacy networks and architectures that enable and automate data governance and compliance. Now, remember the privacy framework where you document information from your consumer, from the location, the network device, and the application, and to help your privacy and risk teams establish the mandated data governance. Now that you have this information gathered, let's have another look at the slide that illustrates the privacy networks. So Mark, if you don't mind pulling that up. So the privacy domains are software-defined networks that transform information by binding or hashing criteria and credentials to the smallest attribute level from everything gathered from an individual. Now, this includes the credentials from the teen, the documents, your verified consent, which you will want. Now, this process takes everything that used to be sensitive information and transforms it into a pseudonymized, obfuscated trust block. Then they can be partitioned and distributed across multiple privacy networks. This is where it comes in handy trying to do verifying identities, which is a huge challenge. So, for example, a participating school with a privacy network may be able to provide additional identity assurances about the age of the teen or their custodial parent, all without affecting the privacy, because everything happens within the privacy network at the attribute trust block level. So I'm so glad you asked that question. It's a big deal, it really is.
Great, thank you, Marcely. The next question that we had that came in is sort of centered around GDPR and services in the EU. So the question is, what do I have to pay attention to when I'm offering goods or services into the EU? And do I have to comply with GDPR even if my place of business is in the US?
You follow the rules for direct collection. Pay attention to the data transfers from Europe to the United States. So here's a legal basis for the transfer, and it's needed, and you need it. You need to be able to use either a Privacy Shield certified or additional legal steps need to be taken. Now, the interesting about the EU and US Privacy Shield is that it's not viewed as comprehensive enough nor governed appropriately across Europe. Some clients might refuse it, demanding different legal basis for the transfer to the US.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that covers the questions that have come in. And so I'd like to thank you, Mark and Marcely, and thank you to everyone who attended today's webinar. We are going to make every effort to get you a copy of our questions and answers. And as a quick reminder, if you haven't downloaded the presentation, please go ahead and do so right now in the handout section. We hope that you found this webinar informative and educational, and that you'll join us for future webinars. You'll also see a brief survey in just a few moments, and we greatly appreciate your feedback on today's event. We value your input, and we thank you for your participation. Thank you, and have a great day.